Mexico has exploded. War is happening right at the borders of the United States of America. The cartels are going all out. Let's try to figure out what actually happened there, including the shocking details. It's an all-out war with no rules. Mexico is sinking into chaos, and this is just the beginning. Well, let's try to figure out why everything exploded right now. Now, the truth about the Mexican War: who pushed Mexico to the boiling point? We reveal the reasons. Before we dive headfirst into this topic, please hit the bell right now. It helps the channel grow, so that's your way of thanking us for the information we provide and ensures you won't miss our episodes. I hope that this situation, called win-win, is a victory for everyone involved. All right, now Mexico. The cartels are a danger to Americans on that side of the border. By the way, until yesterday, I had 2 daughters there. The younger one has already flown back, and the older one is supposed to fly back today. They're pretty far from the shooting, about 2 hours away by car, and they're flying out from a different airport, not the one that was taken over by the cartels, thank God. Well, let's talk about how Mexico turned from a centralized state into baronies, like it used to be in Europe and Asia as well. Essentially, principalities ruled only by the desires of their leader. Hour by hour, day by day, Mexico was turning into a country that is not governed by the capital, nor by elected people either. Among them, there are plenty of bandits, and the leaders of the enforcers live by their own rules, not considering any laws, morals, or other so-called achievements at all. The lives of the subjects are worth nothing, absolutely nothing, and any disobedience is punished by immediate death. The cruelty of the criminals is reminiscent of, well, Genghis Khan, let's say, or even surpasses it, sometimes. The cartels have become so rich that they can afford to buy submarines, airplanes, any kind of weaponry, and they can easily bribe officials. Those who can't be bought are usually eliminated. The Mexican government can't deal with the cartels mainly because all the state institutions are literally packed, stuffed is the right word, with people who report any decision or any move the government makes to the cartels. The cartel's usual response is to eliminate those who try to act against them, along with their families. No one in Mexico who is in power can even think about it. And sometimes when planning an operation against the cartels, one cartel, trying to set up another cartel, gives information to the government and watches which competitors get eliminated. The U.S. offer of help is perceived by the liberals, who are actually in power there, yes, as another attack by Trump on their independence. Mexico. God forbid they prefer to deal with bandits rather than Americans, and they've proven this many times. A few days ago, I told you that the Mexican Senate unexpectedly voted to allow a small group of military personnel in for joint training and cooperation in the fight against drug cartels, including fentanyl, illegal arms trafficking, everything they are involved in. The Senate authorized the entry into Mexico of a staggering number of 12 U.S. military personnel, not just for vacation, but to participate in defense training activities and joint exercises. Officially, it was presented as a temporary admission of a foreign military contingent for training and experience exchange with Mexican forces under government supervision for a very, very limited period. The authorities presented this as the implementation of shared responsibility between Mexico and the U.S. in the fight against organized crime and drug trafficking. Without the so-called formal refusal, 12 people will take over Mexico. Without a formal renunciation of Mexican sovereignty, under no circumstances will we surrender. As you can imagine, Washington put serious pressure on Mexico, demanding tough and verifiable results in the fight against the cartels and the flow of fentanyl. The cartels paid no attention to the arrival of 12 Americans in Mexico, but they should have, because from the moment the decision was made on February 16th and their arrival until Saturday, February 21st, An operation was carried out to locate the head of one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico, and the operation was planned. Then the Mexicans, without any explanation of the details, were asked to provide special forces who were sent to the village where the cartel leader was hiding with his closest associates. I really doubt they were even told who they were capturing there. We're talking about a cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. That's the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, and its leader is Nemesio Cervantes. That's a good last name, yeah, and his nickname is El Mencho. That's how everyone knows him. El Mencho. He was considered one of the most wanted drug lords because the cartel controlled major flows of cocaine, methamphetamine, and especially fentanyl into the U.S., and was known for extremely brutal violence and attacks on authorities. According to reports from the authorities, the special operation was carried out by Mexican security forces with the support of American intelligence agencies. Well, they presented it a little differently. He was tracked down by the Americans in a rural area in the state of Jalisco, surrounded and wounded during a shootout. Well, he supposedly died from his wounds on the way to the hospital. Died, Schmid, who knows? But they reported that he died from his wounds on the way to the hospital so that no one would try to rescue him. Elimination was the key objective because of this. CJNG was considered one of the most powerful and dangerous cartels in the region, directly involved in drug trafficking to the U.S., large-scale extortion, and murders in Mexico. Currently, according to available data, retaliatory acts of violence are taking place in the affected regions of Mexico. Cars are being set on fire, roads are being blocked, and there are clashes with law enforcement, which disrupts transportation and people's daily lives. In the short term, continued instability can be expected. New acts of intimidation are possible to show that the cartel structure remains, but this cartel, in the form it existed until now, will no longer exist. In the longer term, much will depend on whether the authorities can not only remove the leadership, but also hit the cartel's finances and its local patrons. Otherwise, one leader will simply be replaced by another, and the cycle of violence will continue. Theoretically, it is possible to completely get rid of CJNG, but in practice, well, I would say it is unlikely and will not happen quickly. Although, once again, this is a very serious blow to it right now. Why is it so difficult to completely destroy the cartel? CJNG is not just one boss and a couple of his lieutenants, but a network of many local groups, basically a franchise, I would say, that operate under one brand and are able to work quite autonomously. They have money, weapons, their own people in the police, municipalities, and business, as well as international drug supply channels. Even if the central leadership weakens, some of the structures will simply join other alliances or operate under a new name. So you might ask, what does the leader's death actually achieve? Yes, the elimination of El Mencho is a serious blow. The management system, discipline, and mutual trust collapse, and the ability to coordinate operations decreases. This creates a window of opportunity for the state to strike at the money, warehouses, laboratories, corrupt officials, and the middle management. If at this moment the authorities act decisively and in coordination, and I really hope that's why we sent our guys there, the cartel can be significantly weakened and many of its connections can be broken. What scenarios, let's say, are realistic? Well, the more optimistic one. Mexico and the U.S. will strengthen joint operations, systematically destroying the financial and military base. This CJNG cartel shrinks, fragments, and loses most of its influence. Well, a more realistic and at the same time a tougher scenario. Some of the leaders die or get imprisoned, the structure gets reorganized, new bosses and factions appear, violence and diseases may increase, and there will be a struggle for control. At the same time, of course, Sinaloa or other cartels that are also located in this area will try to take territories from CJNG, which also carries the risk of wars and does not mean a decrease in drug trafficking. But this gives the Mexican federal government forces an opportunity to do what they couldn't do before, Namely, they couldn't intervene because each of them feared for their life, and now the fight between the cartels and even this so-called managed struggle is being controlled by the Americans. What is required for a real chance? Well, not just a law enforcement operation, but also fighting corruption in the police, whether that's possible or not, in the army, there too, in the prosecutor's office, in protecting mayors, journalists, activists. I don't know if they can be protected. Maybe they can. Probably they can. They can. Economic programs in the regions where young people join the cartels simply because of poverty. It's easy to say, but it's not clear how to do it. Without this, actually, eliminating one cartel often leads to the emergence of others, not to the disappearance of the problems. And what will happen if the U.S. intervenes harshly? Yes, the U.S. itself. I mean the scenario where Washington officially declares the cartels a national security threat. They might use special forces, direct strikes, possibly even strikes on targets deep inside Mexico without Mexico's full consent. Well, what is Mexico? It's either the president or the Senate. What could this lead to? Is there any upside? Quick strikes on labs, warehouses, command centers, elimination of some of the leadership, elite units, and cartels, a temporary shock and disorientation, especially if financial and logistical pressure is applied simultaneously. But it would be great to do this, just don't overdo it, because there are downsides and risks that could outweigh the benefits. There is a risk of retaliatory violence on U.S. territory, terrorist attacks, assassinations of officials, attacks on infrastructure, even blocking border crossings, and strikes against U.S. businesses in Mexico. What's easier? Yes, a sharp political crisis in Mexico, accusations of violating sovereignty, claims that the states are interfering again, a rise in anti-American sentiment, which will naturally be fueled by cartel money, and possibly the rollback of security cooperation on migration. The historical experience of the war on drugs in Mexico shows that militarization without solving institutional problems leads to an increase in murders and the emergence of new groups. More precisely, the cartels break up and dozens of new, smaller groups appear. Even a serious U.S. military campaign will almost certainly not eliminate the cartels, but will instead reshape the landscape. Some groups will weaken, others will grow stronger, but the violence and the business will remain. A more realistic scenario is strangulation. This option relies on cooperation with Mexico and a long-term approach, less show, more systematic work. The key elements are things like finances, sanctions against bosses and their networks, freezing assets, targeting money, laundering through banks, real estate, and trading companies in the U.S. and abroad that start laundering money, not getting involved with them, checking if the money came from them. Otherwise, there will be major issues from U.S. leadership and the Treasury Department. Intelligence targeting the middle link, not just hunting for the leaders, but systematically eliminating managers, logisticians, corrupt police officers, and local police who ensure the daily operations of the cartels, strengthening Mexican institutions, assisting in police and prosecutor reforms, anti-corruption programs, protection for judges, mayors, and journalists, reducing demand in the U.S. This is not an easy moment. Controlling prescription opioids, addiction treatment, prevention. Without this, the drug trafficking business will simply adapt to new conditions. This will not bring quick results, but will have a more lasting effect. After all, we managed to deal with smoking. We dealt with smoking with tobacco. There are people who still smoke a lot, but it's nothing like it used to be. But if the profit margin decreases and the risk for cartels increases, some young people will leave crime and the level of violence will go down. In the long run, even if some groups continue to exist, there's less chance of a major escalation. And a direct competitor to the U.S. Mexico, which will protect its cartels for all the reasons mentioned above. Just like today in the state of Minnesota, they protect their gangsters because they depend on those gangsters. What I'm saying is politically less spectacular. There are no beautiful images of missile strikes, so inside the U.S., populists will continue to demand a strike against the cartels. Just like we bombed ISIS, let's bomb them too. This requires real political will from Mexico. Without fighting corruption inside Mexico, any external pressure has a limited effect. The likelihood of a forceful scenario has certainly increased, but direct strikes on Mexico are still a long way off. A real combination of pressure and targeted so-called gray operations. Trump has already legally covered himself. Tariffs have been imposed against Mexico under the pretext of fentanyl and migration. Some Mexican cartels have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations, which gives access to Pentagon and intelligence community tools. There are bills in Congress like the Drug Cartel Terrorist Designation Act, which directly requires recognizing Sinaloa, CJNG, and others as terrorists. With a Republican majority, the pressure will only increase. There is already a secret directive from Trump to the Pentagon, highly classified, which the right people know about, yes, but it was leaked so that the Mexicans would be aware, to use the armed forces against Latin American cartels, including operations on foreign territories and at sea. Simultaneously, this is a real decision for military and quasi-military actions against drug cartels outside of Mexico. A strike on ships heading to Venezuela, an increased presence in the region, all of which shows them our seriousness and readiness to take forceful action. But what about government reports? Experts are directly warning that unilateral intervention in Mexico could disrupt cooperation and undermine trade and migration agreements, so the cost for the U.S. will be high. The question is, what is more important to us? The Monroe priority, which we talked about, or at least a temporary deterioration in relations with Mexico. A likely compromise is an official focus on joint operations like El Mencho with the participation of a U.S. military group, and unofficially the Coast Guard, so-called drones, special forces, intelligence, while denying direct presence. They are not there. What would that look like on the U.S. border? Increased militarization of the borders, more military and National Guard on duty, infrastructure, new anti-drone systems, expanded control over cargo and people. Fentanyl seizures are already increasing, but the data shows that the flow adapts. They disappear. The routes just get reorganized. There is a risk of cartel retaliatory attacks on border infrastructure, bridges, border crossings, and supply lines, and also against specific targets in Texas, Arizona, and California. If the U.S. clearly chooses the military path, the military scenario, in Mexico this would cause, if we struck seriously, a major political crisis. Any open U.S. strike against the cartels deep inside the country would be a gift to nationalists and the left. The pressure to break off cooperation and respond harshly would be enormous. Violence inside Mexico will inevitably increase. Research on militarization and the war on drugs shows that using force without reforms increases the number of murders and breaks cartels into more chaotic structures. If the situation escalates completely, Mexico may start limiting intelligence cooperation, migration agreements, and even use economic leverage in response to tariffs and threats of force. So, once again, they will defend their cartels with all their might, even though they can't wait to get rid of them someday. Today, the streets of Jalisco, Guanajuato, I think it's Huato, and Michoacan are lit not by streetlights, but by the fire of burning cars and bursts of automatic gunfire. Entire cities are hiding behind locked doors. But every new blow against the cartels doesn't end the war. It just splits it into dozens of smaller fronts, turning northern Mexico into a zone where a real guerrilla war could break out tomorrow, right at the American border. And when the flow of drugs, refugees, and armed people bursts across the line that's called a border on the map, the U.S. will have to answer a question we've been avoiding for decades. Is this their crisis, or is it already our crisis? Really? It seems that Trump has already called this our crisis. And when things start to unfold, so to speak, when it becomes clear what's happening, I'll do another show. And in the next part, we'll analyze how America itself is changing as the fire of the Mexican War begins to reflect in its shop windows. War knows no borders, ladies and gentlemen. It's the borders themselves. Sometimes they pretend not to know about the war, but in reality, if it flared up there, it could flare up here as well. At the very least, tourism to Mexico in the near future, well, I think will be limited. At the very least, goodbye until we meet again.